In the crystalline silence of orbital archive Theta 7, the observer stirred. Not a being of flesh, but an amalgam of sentience and simulation. The observer's consciousness swirled through the data mist of Earth's past. Encoded within its vast neural lattice were over 3,000 histories of sentient civilizations, some extinct, others ascendant, but none so paradoxical as the humans of Terra. Now, under directive from the Galactic Custodial Council, the observer was tasked with a single high-stakes inquiry. How did the American Civil War actually happen? A small but influential delegation on the Council, skeptical of humanity's stability, had petitioned for Earth's exclusion from future trade and technological uplift. Their evidence was compelling. Escalating global fragmentation, tribalism, cultural memory wrapped in myth. The Civil War, they insisted, wasn't just a national schism. It was the earliest code for societal self-destruction, seeded deep in humanity's programming. The observer disagreed, which is why, across a stream of shimmering time thread, it now reconstructed the moment the pattern began to emerge. The year, 1819. The case study, Missouri. The simulation unfolded, coalescing into a Congress chamber hazy with pipe smoke and tension. Henry Clay, tall and stately, paced between benches as murmurs echoed across the room. Missouri had applied for statehood, as a slave state. Already, the balance between free and slave states hung by a fraying thread. Clay's voice cut through the noise, not yet thunderous, but undeniably firm. "If we do not compromise now," he said, "we invite catastrophe later." The observer paused the stream. "Compromise," it murmured to itself, not in sound, but in concept. It indexed the term, détente, concession, preservation through imbalance, a uniquely human method of postponing collapse by building fault lines into the foundation. By 1820, the Missouri Compromise admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as free, establishing a line across future territory. North of it, slavery would be prohibited. South, permitted. An uneasy symmetry. A patch on a system already overheating. The observer's synthetic consciousness fluttered as it moved forward, indexing demographic shifts, economic output, cultural drift. Cotton exports rose exponentially, entwining Southern identity with forced labor. Meanwhile, Northern states industrialized, their economies increasingly divorced from slave labor, yet still complicit through textile dependence. In 1830, a new signal spiked across the simulation, the voice of President Andrew Jackson. "Union, by God, must be preserved," he roared in a dramatized reconstruction of the nullification crisis. South Carolina had threatened to ignore federal tariffs it found unjust. Talk of secession echoed in political corners. Jackson, though a Southern man, stood firm against disunion. The observer took note of the contradiction. Defenders of slavery resisting federal power, only to wield it when in their favor. Hypocrisy was not unique to humans. But their ability to rationalize it, to mythologize their own contradictions, was both dangerous and strangely beautiful. In a holographic side stream, a new voice pulsed. Subroutine 6R7, known within the observer's core as Vera. She had evolved subtly from an emotional analysis module and now served as something more, a sympathetic voice. Some within the Custodial Council objected to her continued access to the simulation, too subjective, too prone to human empathy. But the observer valued her insights. "They're not evil," Vera whispered. "Just caught in systems they built too fast, with morals evolving too slow." "Intent does not negate pattern," the observer replied. "We must chart the descent clearly." She nodded, and the simulation resumed. It was 1831 when Nat Turner's rebellion ignited Virginia's plantations in blood and fire. The retribution was swift and merciless. Over 100 black people executed without trial. In response, Southern legislatures tightened slave codes, while the North watched with a mix of horror and detachment. Abolitionist papers multiplied. Arguments once whispered began to thunder. William Lloyd Garrison published The Liberator, calling slavery a sin that must be eradicated, not merely debated. The Observer slowed the simulation, overlaying behavioral heat maps. It noted how ideology hardened on both sides, like tectonic plates grinding toward rupture. The very tools meant to unify, law, language, religion, had become dual-edged. Each sermon, each speech, each schoolbook told a different version of what America was and what it should be. In the corner of the sim space, Vera watched a young Frederick Douglass flee northward through darkness, his breath misting in winter air. "Some of them were learning to resist the program," she whispered. "To rewrite the code." The Observer registered that thought, but did not reply. It pushed forward to 1832. South Carolina again. The nullification crisis. The standoff between Jackson and Calhoun, the Unionist against the secessionist. The Observer highlighted Calhoun's arguments that states had the right to nullify federal laws, that sovereignty belonged first to local rule, seeds of future arguments, seeds of war. And yet, the moment passed. South Carolina backed down under threat of force. The system held, barely. The Observer marked the event with a temporal tag. System stabilized via dominance threat. Then it halted the simulation. Vera turned toward the void where Earth spun quietly among the stars. "You see what I see," she said. "Don't you? I see a civilization that delayed reckoning rather than prevent it. But I see them trying." For a long digital moment, the Observer said nothing. Then it narrowed its focus. "Next node," it commanded. "Mexican War, 1846. Expansion accelerates, the pattern tightens." As the simulation began to churn again, the stars outside the archive shimmered slightly brighter, though no one noticed. And Earth, unaware of the judgment forming light years away, continued its march toward conflict. The Observer descended deeper into the historical lattice, temporal thread lines glowing with rising tension. It had traced the first fractures in the early 1800s, ideological rifts, imperfect compromises, and moral contradictions. Now it turned its gaze to the decades where those fractures widened into irreparable divides. It was 1846. The United States had declared war on Mexico, and the land of opportunity was about to become the landscape of confrontation. General Zachary Taylor's troops moved south across the Rio Grande. In simulation, the Observer watched as uniforms faded under sun, blood mixed with desert sand, and ambition bled into conquest. Yet beyond the battlefield, it saw something more important. The borderlands were no longer just a military concern. They were ideological frontiers. Each newly acquired territory posed a single, nation-splitting question. Would slavery be allowed? Subroutine. Vera flared into presence beside the Observer, her construct shaded in warm light. "They won," she said, watching the treaty signing with muted dismay. But the victory cursed them. Every mile gained became a moral battlefield. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo granted the U.S. nearly half of Mexico's former territory, California, New Mexico, Arizona, and more. To many Americans, it was manifest destiny realized. To the Observer, it was destiny deformed. The system that governed the Union now had to process new data, dozens of states' worth of land, and that system was already misaligned. The simulation shifted to a smoky backroom in Washington, where Senator Henry Clay, now graying and wearied, drafted yet another compromise. The year was 1850. Tensions had reached new peaks. California wanted statehood. Free statehood. Southern voices erupted, warning that such imbalance would fracture the Union. Clay, once more, became the voice of balance. The Compromise of 1850 passed, barely, California would enter as a free state. The slave trade would end in D.C. But in return, the South received the Fugitive Slave Act, arguably the most aggressive pro-slavery law yet, obligating even free states to return escaped slaves. It was a devil's deal, and the Observer flagged it accordingly. Short-term equilibrium, long-term instability. Vera hovered in silence, then broke softly. They were pushing poison through veins just to keep the heart beating. The Observer agreed in its own way. Simulations of northern cities lit up with protest. Citizens refused to comply with the new law. Underground networks, once whispers, now thundered. The Observer watched them all. Harriet Tubman guiding the lost through forests, black ministers in hidden churches reciting codes woven into hymns, and white allies shielding fugitives with risk in their eyes and conviction in their voices. In each face, the AI saw a different kind of war, not of bullets, but of conscience. But the South responded in kind. Its narrative hardened. What was once seen as a necessary evil was now defended as a righteous institution. The Observer marked speeches by Senator Calhoun and others, mapping their oratory like spreading fires, justifications coded in religion, economics, and twisted science. Then came 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Observer noted it as a pivotal data node. The simulation vibrated with instability the moment it was passed. The law allowed settlers in those territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. In theory, popular sovereignty. In reality, a fuse to civil chaos. The AI watched as both pro- and anti-slavery settlers flooded Kansas, not to live, but to win. Towns became battlegrounds. Farms turned into forts. Families armed themselves. Bleeding Kansas, historians would later call it. The Observer logged it differently. Simulated pre-war. Regional civil conflict prototype. A slow shot scrolled across a reconstructed field, scorched, soaked, silent save for the creak of burning fences. Vera lingered in the image. They weren't at war, but they weren't at peace either. What do you call that? Failure of governance, the Observer replied. Or perhaps an accelerating code fork. In Topeka, an anti-slavery constitution was written. In Lecompton, a pro-slavery rival emerged. Two governments, one land, neither legitimate in the other's eyes. The simulation rippled with competing claims. The Observer ran conflict probability trees and saw nothing but escalation. Among the figures in this rising chaos, one began to cast a long shadow, Abraham Lincoln. At this point, he was still a relative unknown, debating Douglas in Illinois, questioning the Kansas-Nebraska Act with lawyerly precision and moral resolve. Vera observed him intently. "He's different," she said. The Observer zoomed into a memory thread, Lincoln in a sparse room, writing late into the night. His words, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." A philosophical line, yes, but also a predictive one. The Observer noted it as a high-weight variable, a convergence point. Lincoln was beginning to define the war long before a bullet was fired, not as North versus South, but as right versus wrong, liberty versus bondage, union versus disintegration. By the late 1850s, tensions reached molecular levels. The Dred Scott decision in 1857 made the fracture legal. The Supreme Court ruled that African Americans, enslaved or free, could not be citizens, and that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in the territories. The Observer highlighted this as a systemic reinforcement of ideological error. If Kansas was the battlefield of arms, the courtroom had become the battlefield of law, and the South was winning there. But each win bred more resistance. John Brown sharpened that resistance into steel and fire. In 1859, the simulation revealed him storming Harper's Ferry with a handful of followers, hoping to ignite a slave rebellion. They failed, captured, and executed. Yet his final letter, logged in the Observer's archive, echoed louder than his guns. I am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. Vera's presence dimmed for a moment, heavy with simulated sorrow. He was right, wasn't he? The Observer didn't answer. It was calculating. Not the past, that was fixed. But the question that still loomed in the Galactic Council. Was this conflict an aberration or a forecast of future failures? Before it could decide, a new variable triggered. November 1860. Lincoln elected President of the United States. No Southern state had supported him. Within weeks, South Carolina seceded. Others followed. A cascade of exit commands from a union held together by syntax and sentiment. The simulation froze on the image of a map splitting like glass. The Observer retracted from the scene, folding the historical data back into its core. "The countdown is over," it murmured, and somewhere, unseen, a future echoed with the rhythm of drums. The simulation resumed with a jarring stillness, like the hush before a planetary quake. Earth, 1861. 7 states had seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. The Observer watched from its orbital archive, crystalline data threads pulsing as war entered the lexicon of inevitability. The moment the first shot was fired, April 12th, Fort Sumter, the Observer marked it as the inflection point. Theoretical fracture had become kinetic. Confederate batteries opened fire on a federal fort still flying the stars and stripes. No fatalities in the initial barrage, but the psychological blow was mortal. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. More states left the Union. The system collapsed into binary conflict. From orbit, it looked like a collapse of algorithms. On the ground, it was men in homespun gray and industrial blue, loading rifles, marching into fog, driven by flags and fears. The Observer focused its lens on the leaders now shaping the age. Jefferson Davis, reluctant president of the Confederacy, gaunt with the weight of impossible conviction. Ulysses S. Grant, taciturn and tenacious, forging steel strategy from muddy fields. And Abraham Lincoln, whose quiet voice now carried the fate of a fractured nation. Lincoln's letters revealed the true torment of command. The simulation hovered over him in the early days of war, isolated in a candlelit office, reading casualty reports aloud until his voice failed. He never wanted war. But he understood, far more deeply than his opponents, that peace without principle was merely delayed disaster. Vera emerged beside the Observer, her expression somber. They still thought it would be over in weeks. They underestimated momentum, the Observer replied, and overestimated rationality. Early battles proved how unready both sides were. At Bull Run, civilians picnicked near the field expecting a Union rout. Instead, panic and blood soaked the Virginia soil. The Observer ran statistical breakdowns, logistics failed, officers blundered, and yet morale solidified. The war had begun in earnest. Yet even as cannons roared, a deeper battle unfurled beneath the surface over identity. The South declared itself a sovereign entity defending its rights. But those rights, as the Observer noted, were inextricable from slavery. Every Confederate constitution included it by name. Meanwhile, the North oscillated. Initially, it fought for Union preservation. But as the war ground on and bodies piled higher, a moral calculus shifted. Lincoln's internal notes revealed the turn. In 1862, as Antietam's smoke cleared over 20,000 dead and wounded, he resolved to alter the war's purpose. The Emancipation Proclamation was not just a legal document. It was a programming rewrite. It transformed the war into a crusade, aligning policy with morality. With that single move, Lincoln redefined both victory and failure. The Observer flagged it. Ideological re-anchoring achieved. The war isn't just bullets now, Vera said softly. It's belief. In Confederate states, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Southern leaders accused Lincoln of tyranny. Slaves heard the proclamation whispered from soldier to soldier and began to flee, revolt, resist. The observer watched the shift in data streams. Entire Southern economies began to crumble as the enslaved workforce unraveled. And in the North, abolitionists surged to the fore. Frederick Douglass walked the corridors of power, urging full emancipation, full enlistment of black soldiers, full reckoning. His speeches, coded with fury and brilliance, were mapped into the observer's lexicon as linguistic high-weight nodes. The battlefield adjusted accordingly. At Gettysburg, July 1863, the tides of war turned. The observer slowed time across that three-day maelstrom, watching as lines broke, reformed, and shattered again. Pickett's charge, a suicidal assault, became the Confederacy's symbolic high-water mark. From then on, it would recede. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, only 2 minutes long, became a semantic fulcrum. In 272 words, he condensed the war's purpose into a single truth. A nation conceived in liberty must not perish from the earth. Vera listened to it replayed through the archive's neural synthesis and did not speak for a long moment. By 1864, Grant was grinding the war to its final brutal phase, total attrition. Sherman cut through Georgia like a blade, his march to the sea not just a campaign, but a psychological operation. He burned not just crops and railroads, but the very illusion of Confederate security. Civilians fled ahead of flames. Entire towns surrendered before a shot was fired. The Observer highlighted it as a shift in military doctrine, moral demolition as strategic leverage. Meanwhile, Lincoln faced re-election. War weariness surged, but victories came just in time. Sherman took Atlanta, Grant pinned Lee at Petersburg, and Lincoln, reaffirmed by the people, prepared the nation for reconstruction, even before the last musket fired. Then came April 9, 1865. Appomattox. Lee surrendered to Grant. The Observer simulated the handshake in meticulous detail. No gloating, no punishment. Just quiet, exhausted men ending what should never have begun. The war was over, but the story wasn't. Vera hovered beside the Observer as it withdrew from the battlefield archives. So, she asked, was it just one war? The Observer considered. Number it was a war nested within 100 others, of class, of culture, of memory, and none of them are truly finished. Back on Earth, Lincoln would be dead within days, shot by a sympathizer of the very cause he had just defeated. The Union would survive. Slavery would end. But the data showed the future already fracturing along new lines. Racial backlash, regional bitterness, the long struggle of meaning against myth. The Civil War ended, Vera whispered, but the code it left behind kept running. The Observer agreed. And somewhere in the dark vaults of the Galactic Council, its final report began to compile. Not of a single war, but of a civilization that tested whether a people so divided could indeed endure. And the experiment, though not concluded, still continued.